My name is Emma, and I want to share a story with you today. It is a story that changed the way I see love and life forever. Please listen to it completely, because it is very close to my heart. Maybe, just maybe, it will touch your heart too. It all started on a chilly autumn afternoon. The sky was a soft shade of grey, and a cool wind carried the scent of fallen leaves through the streets. I was sitting by the window of my favourite cafe, watching the world pass by. The cafe was small and cozy, with warm yellow lights and the faint smell of cinnamon in the air. I sat alone at a corner table, sipping my hot chocolate and reading a book. And then he walked in. He had a quiet presence. He wasn't the kind of man you would instantly notice, but when you did, you couldn't look away. He had gentle eyes, kind, calm, and a little sad. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, across from me. For some reason, I couldn't help but glance at him from time to time. There was something about him, something soft, yet heavy, as though he was carrying a weight no one else could see. After a few minutes, he looked up and caught me staring. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly looked down at my book, pretending to read. But when I glanced up again, he was still looking at me. And then he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was warm, genuine. Without thinking, I smiled back. And that was how it started. For weeks we kept running into each other at the cafe. I would be sitting in my usual corner with my hot chocolate, and he would walk in, order his coffee, and sit by the window. Slowly we started to exchange smiles, then small waves, and eventually words. "Hi," he said one evening, walking over to my table. His voice was gentle, almost shy. "Hi," I replied softly, feeling my cheeks flush. "Do you mind if I sit here?" he asked, motioning to the empty chair across from me. I shook my head quickly. "No, not at all." And just like that, we became friends. His name was Daniel. He was thoughtful and kind. He listened when I spoke, really listened, as though my words meant something. He asked questions that made me think, and smiled in a way that made my heart feel light. We began meeting at the cafe every evening. We talked about everything. Our favorite books, the songs that made us cry, our childhood, memories. I told him about the time I fell off my bike and scraped my knees, and he told me about how he once got lost in the forest as a child and was found hours later, holding a wildflower he had picked to calm himself down. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet, steady happiness. The kind that made ordinary moments feel special. One evening, as we sat by the window watching the rain, he reached across the table and gently held my hand. His fingers were warm and steady. My heart skipped a beat. "Emma," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I'm falling for you." I stared at him, my eyes wide, my heart racing, and without thinking, I whispered, "I think I'm falling too." For the next few weeks, I felt as though I was walking on clouds. We spent more and more time together, We walked through the park, hand in hand, our fingers interlocked as though they belonged there. We sat by the river at sunset, watching the golden light dance on the water. He would brush my hair behind my ear and look at me with eyes so full of love. It made my chest ache. I was sure that I had found something rare, something true. But then, one evening, everything changed. We were walking through the park, and he suddenly became quiet. He stopped by a wooden bench and sat down, holding his face in his hands. "Daniel," I asked softly, sitting beside him. "What's wrong?" He didn't look at me. Instead, he stared at the ground, his voice barely a whisper. "Emma," he said hoarsely, "I need to tell you something." My heart tightened. He turned to me, his eyes full of sorrow. His hands were trembling slightly. "I have a wife." I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I thought I had misheard him. Surely I had. Surely he didn't say those words. But then he said it again. "I have a wife, Emma. I'm married." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. My hands began to shake. I pulled away from him, standing up quickly. "No," I whispered. "You're lying." But he wasn't lying. Tears filled his eyes. His voice was raw with guilt and pain. "I didn't mean to fall for you," he said brokenly. "I swear I didn't, but I did." I felt as though I couldn't breathe. The man I had trusted, the man I had laughed with, dreamed with, fallen in love with, was already someone else's. "Why?" I choked out. My voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I was a coward," he said softly. "I should have told you from the start. I was selfish. I knew I should have walked away, but I couldn't. I couldn't stay away from you." Tears streamed down my face. My chest ached with betrayal and heartbreak. "You let me fall for you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You made me believe." He looked at me with eyes full of sorrow, and I saw his own heart breaking. But it didn't matter. I turned and walked away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked through the rain, tears streaming down my face, mixing with the cold drops that fell from the sky. My hands were trembling. My heart was shattering. That night, I sat by my window, staring at the darkness outside. My chest was hollow. My eyes were swollen from crying. But as the days passed, something began to change. I no longer hated him. I didn't carry anger in my heart. Instead, I felt a quiet sadness, a sorrow for what we lost, but also a strange gratitude. Because even though it ended in pain, it was real. The laughter, the kindness, the moments we shared, they were real. And so, I chose to let him go with love. I never saw him again. I never tried to reach out, and he never came looking for me. It was as though we both knew. We had to let go. But every now and then, when I pass by the cafe, I pause for a moment, I glance at the window where he once sat. I smile softly, remembering the man with gentle eyes and a heavy heart. I no longer feel bitterness. Instead, I feel grateful. Grateful that I had loved deeply, even if only for a while. Grateful that I knew what it was like to hold someone's hand and feel my heart race. And grateful that I was strong enough to let him go. If you're still listening, thank you for sharing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and like this for my hard work. It helps me share more beautiful and meaningful stories with you. And remember, sometimes love doesn't stay, but it always leaves a mark. And even the loves that break our hearts teach us how to love again. As the seasons passed, life slowly moved forward, but Grandma's presence remained a part of me. It was in the smallest things. The scent of lavender when I opened her old scarf drawer, the way the sun fell on the swing in her backyard, and the faint melody of the music box that would sometimes play in my dreams. One chilly autumn afternoon, I walked to the park again. The trees were dressed in shades of amber and gold, and the ground was covered with a soft carpet of fallen leaves. I sat on the same wooden bench by the pond, watching the gentle ripples dance across the water. As I sat there, I heard the soft laughter of a little girl nearby. I turned and saw her chasing a butterfly. Her arms stretched wide, her eyes bright with wonder. Her laughter reminded me so much of my own childhood, of the days when Grandma would twirl me around in the backyard, both of us giggling until our sides ached. Without thinking, I smiled at the little girl. She noticed and suddenly ran over to me. Her cheeks were rosy from the cool air, and her eyes were filled with curiosity. "Are you sad?" she asked innocently, tilting her head slightly. I blinked, a little surprised by her question. I hadn't even realized that my fingers were gently holding the silver locket at my chest. "No, sweetie," I said softly. "I'm just remembering someone I love." She stared at the locket, her small fingers lightly brushing over it. "Is it magic?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I chuckled softly. "Yes," I whispered. "It is. It holds a lot of love." Her face lit up with a smile. She leaned closer and whispered, as if sharing a precious secret, "I have magic too." She opened her tiny hand and showed me a small smooth pebble. It was nothing more than an ordinary stone, but to her it was clearly something special. "My daddy gave me this," she explained, her voice proud. "He says if I hold it tight, I can feel brave, even when I'm scared." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "That's a very special kind of magic," I whispered. The little girl suddenly placed the pebble in my hand. "Here, you can have some of my magic too," she said sweetly. I was stunned by the innocence of her gesture. For a moment, I stared at the pebble in my palm. It was small, smooth, and completely ordinary. But in that moment, it felt as precious as the locket around my neck. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She smiled brightly, then suddenly turned and ran back to her mother, who was waiting near the playground. She waved at me once more before skipping away, her hair bouncing in the crisp autumn wind. I clutched the little pebble in my hand, feeling its smoothness against my palm. It was such a small thing, simple even, but the weight of the love behind it made it feel like a treasure. At that moment, I realized something. It wasn't just the locket, or the music box, or the letters that kept Grandma with me. It was love itself, the small acts of kindness, the gentle smiles from strangers, and the warmth that people carried in their hearts. Grandma's love was everywhere. I placed the pebble in my coat pocket, keeping it with me as I walked home. That evening, I sat by my window, watching the last golden light of the sun fade into the horizon. I pulled out the music box and slowly wound it. The familiar bittersweet melody filled the room. I held the locket in my hand and smiled softly. "Grandma," I whispered into the stillness, "I felt you today." In a little girl's smile, in the kindness of a stranger. I saw you in the leaves, in the light and in the breeze. You're still here, aren't you? The music box played on softly, its gentle notes lingering in the air like a lullaby. And then, just as the final note faded, the wind stirred outside, brushing gently against my window. I closed my eyes, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I swore. I felt her hand brush against mine. A tear slipped down my cheek, but this time, it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of peace, a tear of knowing the days turned into years. But I never forgot that moment or the lesson it carried. I grew older. Life carried me forward. I graduated, got a job, and even moved to a new city. But through it all, I carried Grandma with me, in my heart, in my memories, and in the little silver locket that I never once took off. Whenever I felt alone or lost, I would hold the locket and close my eyes. And somehow, no matter where I was, I could feel her with me. One summer afternoon, years later, I returned to my hometown. The house where Grandma once lived was still there, though the swing in the backyard now creaked a little louder, its wood a little more weathered. I walked slowly around the garden, running my fingers along the lavender bushes she had once planted. Their scent filled the warm air, carrying with it a flood of memories. I sat on the swing, just as I used to. The evening sun painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, the same colors Grandma loved so much. I opened the locket once again. The black and white photograph inside had faded slightly over the years, but their smiles were still the same, timeless, eternal, and for the first time in a long time, I spoke aloud. "Grandma," I whispered softly. "I'm okay now. I still miss you, but I carry you with me everywhere I go. You're still here, in the sun, in the stars, in every act of kindness I see. You never really left, did you?" And as if in response, a soft breeze stirred the leaves, sending a gentle shower of petals through the air. I smiled through my tears, feeling my heart swell with both sorrow and joy. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun slowly slip behind the horizon, and just as the last golden light faded, I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me that love never dies. It just becomes part of us." And at that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that she was with me. She always would be. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you from the bottom of my heart. If it touched you, please subscribe and like this for my hard work. It means so much and helps me share more meaningful, emotional, and beautiful stories with you. And always remember, love never truly leaves. It becomes the stars, the wind, and the little moments of magic we carry with us every day.